Putin's war on Ukraine is now a war against Russia's own future. The Kremlin launched this invasion to restore an empire. It is dismantling, though, Russia from within. A million Russian casualties, collapsing industry, and empty villages show a country that is burning its own future to hold a few lines on a map. Money that should build schools and hospitals is blown up in Ukraine, or stolen by the generals, or lost in the corruption. And inside the Russian army, soldiers are lied to on paper and robbed in the trenches. But inside of Russia, strategic industry is hit by Ukrainian drones and also by Russian incompetence. But at the same time, the elite are moving their children and their money to Europe. Meanwhile, the conscripts are forced to pay for their own funerals. In the West, a relatively small investment weakens a nuclear power at a great discount. This is no longer just a war over Ukrainian territory. It is a test of whether Ukraine and the West will push a failing system to defeat or let it decay in place as a long-term threat. You can see this collapse of trust and capacity first in the Russian army itself. You can see the way that Russia treats its soldiers, explaining why this war is destroying Russia from the inside. We see that the Russian soldiers are used to seeing in their own army betrayal because it's routine. But that betrayal goes further. The contempt you see is in the trenches is the same contempt that kills air crews before they even reach the front. On a bomber base in Russia just earlier today, ejection seats misfired during routine checks and hurled a crew into a concrete ceiling. Of course, they died within minutes, but the command there, it logged this as a technical incident, not as a combat loss. The message to every crew is very simple. Your own system can kill you, then pretend you never served. Because they did not die in active combat, their families won't get the payoff. That same instinct to hide failure shows up in the paperwork of the dead. In the Pokrovsk sector in eastern Ukraine, commanders changed how their recorded soldiers were killed. Well, in fact, they reported they were not killed. They were AWOL. They had run off from their units. But simply not the case. Russian commanders are putting this label to hide the real casualty numbers, to block compensation for the families. An internal list already contained hundreds of names marked as deserter who never fled. Officers admit that it's easier to write down deserter than to explain where the body went. Now, every soldier understands that he could die in battle and still be written up as if he'd run away. So when even death on the front line does not guarantee honor, every soldier knows his loyalty will not be repaid. You see the same contempt in most of the basic things: clothes, food, and medicine. Pro-Kremlin propagandist Yuri Podlyaka, he admitted that the army still lacks basic socks and underwear for its soldiers. After more than 3 years of war, volunteers, not the state, clothe many of the frontline units. Pre-war norms remain, with one uniform set to last for at least 6 months. Now, soldiers use monthly salaries of roughly $2,100 to $3,200 to buy their own food, their own gear, their own fuel, and their own equipment. They pay for electronic warfare systems out of their own pockets. They pay for the funerals of their comrades at their own expense. A pro-war medical channel showed frontline troops opening its kits. When it opened the kits, it found that the boxes were from 1977. Sure enough, there were Soviet logos on them, showing that they were Soviet bandages, cotton, and dressings. What's incredible is that today, Russia, a country that likes to promote itself as a world leader, is being shown to be a total paper tiger. Look at Sergei Shoigu. He had boasted for many years on television about the new showers, the new uniforms, the weekly underwear changes. But now that's no longer the case. We see that for ordinary Russian soldiers, there's a very large gap between the political speeches and what they experience on the front. And today, there's a reason they trust the state less. Russia is sacrificing a generation for almost no gain on the map. The casualty ledger shows the scale of what the Kremlin is burning to hold its lines. The Economist recently estimated that Russian battlefield losses are between 1 million and 1,350,000. That total counts killed, wounded, and injured since February 24th, 2022. It is higher than all American soldiers killed or wounded in World War II. Analysts say that up to 1% of Russia's fighting-age men have already been killed. Today we see that within Russia, there is a huge fight as more and more regions say they cannot afford to pay the death benefits. So if you go off to die in this war, and you do die, there is a good chance that one of two things will happen. Either your officers will say that you went AWOL, that you ran away, and hence your family gets no compensation. Or they can say that they found your body, but you'd run off first, in which case you still get no compensation, and then the body has to be buried. But who's going to pay for that? Your friends and relatives have to pay for that. But let's imagine a third option. They decide that you did die in battle. Then the state says to you, sorry, there's just not enough money to pay for this. How is it that you think the morale is today in the Russian army? How do you think the soldiers there feel? Well, the reality is this. Today, they are having a great deal of bloodshed, but the gains are microscopic. There have been no large city change of hands in years in this war. Pokrovsk is still not fully captured after 14 months of fighting. Russia is cutting into its own future for a few useless kilometers of the ground. It is trading away its future workforce for almost invisible lines on a map, and Ukraine takes those numbers and it's aiming to make them worse. It is attacking Russia's oil, its steel, and its logistics. Ukrainian strikes and Russian accidents now are striking across Russia. And these attacks, what we see Ukraine doing, for instance, the ones last night, that was Ukraine attacking the Alchevsk steel plant in Lugansk. That plant pours steel into Russian shell casings and armor repairs that later hit Ukraine and try to take over this country. But these strikes are deliberately hitting the federal budget as well. They are going after Russia's ability to produce more money. The attacks in Ryazan at the oil refineries, 500 kilometers, 310 miles from Ukraine, those are significant. Those attacks are ones that will delimitate Russia's ability to continue fighting. Russia today is facing a grave economic problem. And it's a problem that will not get better. It's a problem that will definitely get worse. There's a simple reason for it. Today, the Russians understand that their economy has no means to keep going. The way that the Russian economy continues to operate today, because many have asked, is very simple. The government issues bonds. Those bonds are then purchased by the government. A different branch of the government then purchases them as well. It is in fact sort of a Ponzi scheme. One section of the government is printing them, and the other group is printing the money that then buys them, and they are exchanged back and forth. Today, the Russian government has no other sources of money. It had hoped that China would come for the big bailout, but China has expressed no interest in dropping a ton of money into a country that it knows cannot repay. China is much more interested in a different game. It's a game where it looks at a weakened and broken Russia and buys up its assets. It's one where it looks at a Russia that is broken and makes sure that it becomes the lesser of the two in all future relationships. Today, the situation for Russia is definitely not going to get better. Just look at what happened with General Alexander Tokarev. He took part in the invasion of Ukraine and appears on Ukrainians' list of war criminals. But his daughter, age 22, Anastasia, she recently received a visa to Europe. She travels across NATO countries without trouble, and she admits that she sometimes spends up to $11,000 per vacation. That is liquidity no conscript will ever control. Her quote in the press there was that she doesn't give a damn about anything or what happens further because she has to take care of herself first. I prefer to suffer in France, she said, quote, which is very much what we've heard from other Russians as well. And in fact, Vladimir Putin's illegitimate daughter is also in France. So today, while the Russian military doesn't have enough money to clothe its soldiers or to bury them, it does have enough money for the generals' daughters, those who are embezzling billions of dollars from their own state. But that's what this war has always been about. This war is about people like Timur Ivanov, who just now has had his assets confiscated. As you know, Timur was a former deputy minister of defense of Russia who's been arrested after Shoigu fell as the minister of defense. Now, they've taken assets worth about $13 million. That includes tons of different properties and lands and cars. But what's so interesting about this is not the fact that they found an additional $4 million of cash. It's the fact that today it explains perfectly what is really happening inside of Russia. This war from day one has never been about invading Ukraine. This war has been about how to maximize profits. Russia today is engaged in a global war, is engaged in a war right now against the West. It is engaged in a war by fighting what it does to support things like Hezbollah, supporting things like Iran, supporting things like North Korea, like Venezuela. Today, the Russian government is linked up with narco cartels and other criminals. And the reason is simple. It's not because they're good friends. Their ideologies are quite different. It's because they all have something in common. They are all people who don't care about society. They care about their own well-being. They became dictators, or they became criminals, or they became terrorists because they had thought of themselves first, what they wanted ahead of the societies. And today, they're all blacklisted. They are all sanctioned or illegal organizations. So they cannot deal with the normal commerce. They can't work normally with other countries. So they work with each other. They have a black market that allows them to all work together. So today, Vladimir Putin would view the situation to be a little bit different than many others might appreciate. Vladimir Putin believes he's currently engaged in World War IV. He believes that World War III was the Cold War, and that's a war that Russia lost. The Soviet Union collapsed. So today, World War IV, it took lessons from World War II. To have a hot war like World War II, where you have huge navies attacking each other at sea, large land assaults, that's expensive and it's very high risk. Much cheaper is things like the Cold War, where you can fight global wars across Africa, Asia, Latin America, and in the countries of your enemies. And as you're doing it, you never declare war. You always do things right underneath the threshold of Article 5. And by doing that, you make sure that the West will not respond to your attacks. Though the Russians are quite brazen and they carry out terrorism in the West, they engage in sabotage. They engage in trying to create election fraud as well as internal strife within these countries. The West does not respond. The West allows it all to continue. And the reason is we don't consider it to be a war. The Russians, however, they do. The Russians have overthrown governments in the past couple of years in Niger, Burkina Faso. They've thrown over governments in other countries as well, and today they are supporting regimes like that of Nicolas Maduro's. They are working with the Iranian government. And despite the fact that these are all enemies of the West, these are countries actively working against us, we choose not to call it a war. We think of this as a war between Russia and Ukraine, but it's not. Ukraine is but only one battlefield in a global war that Russia believes it is today fighting. And that's why it's so interesting that today Americans might be starting to realize this. In the United States, we see more statistics coming in that public opinion is moving towards Ukraine. A new poll that came out from the Ronald Reagan Institute shows that 64% of Americans support providing weapons for Ukraine. That is 9% more than last year. That's the highest level since February 2022. Around 62% of respondents believe Ukraine must win this war. They reject the idea of accepting a compromise with Russia. Support for NATO has reached a record 68%. There is stronger backing now for Article 5 than there has been before. Day in and day out, we see the numbers in the West are shifting in the right direction. People realize that Russia today is fighting a war and not really about Ukraine. Ukraine is just one part. It is part of a global effort, an effort to destabilize the West. These criminal actors, like the Kremlin itself, like its allies in its foreign capitals, are all set upon destroying the Western system. And the best way to destroy the Western system is to see this indecision in this West, this indecision to support Ukraine. Ukraine, when it was receiving the largest amount that it received of U.S. assistance, it only came down to about 5% of the Pentagon's budget per year. So consider Washington's proposed budget, which still risks starving what is in reality a uniquely efficient investment. The Pentagon's draft budget allocates $800 million to support Ukraine in 2026 and 2027. Now, of course, that is a very small line item compared to what Ukraine used to receive. Very often, we saw packages before of more than $1 billion or $2 billion. Today, we see less of that. And there's an expectation from Washington that the Europeans will have to pick up that cost. The argument is very simple behind this. The argument is that today, Europe is closer, obviously, to Russia, but something else. It is Europe that must take care of this huge threat because Americans are more interested in China. Now, China is a much larger country, and strategically in the long term is a very large threat. But today, there is a fire in Europe, and the Americans to turn their back on this would be a huge loss. It's irrational because the ally of China today is, in fact, Russia. So if we go and we stop Russia now in Ukraine, that is a sign to China. As a sign to China that will not have a free hand in what happens next in the Pacific. That is something that serves American interest. That is something that today would help Europe, but also help Ukraine. But in the end, it helps America first. So if we are interested in what's best for America, what is best for the future, we have to look carefully at what is happening today. Today, the world is unfortunately not united behind Ukraine. Yet the situation inside of Russia is clearly worsening. The situation inside of Russia has become so bad that we see the elites are beginning to panic. The elites themselves realize that things are not going the right way. The things in the very near term could get much, much worse. And that's why today it's so important that we do what is necessary, this final last bit, to make sure that we defeat Russia. A defeat of Russia is something that we've spent generations and incredible billions of dollars to make a reality. And today, it can happen if we wish to allow it to happen. Thank you for watching. Please like this video. Please subscribe to this channel and consider becoming a channel member today. And please do see the first pinned comment below about how you too can help the Ukrainian soldiers to get life-saving equipment and drones. As always, thank you for supporting Ukraine.